Or Romans chapter 3, we'll start with verse 26. Verse 26 says, to declare, as I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also, seeing it is one God which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. All right? So we finish up the chapter. Just want to point out a few things before we get into it. We have been talking about the being justified freely. God set forth Christ as a propitiation through faith in his blood, right? And then part of that is verse 26. He says, to declare, I say. Notice where he says, at this time. Remember those time elements throughout. Paul says, but now, at this time, all of that. So just pay attention to that. And it says, the big thing here, that he might be just and the justifier, right? Because how can God be just and justify a sinner? Which that's what we've been talking about this whole time, right? Because it can't just be that he winks at sin, right? Can't he just say, I'll just let it slide? Because then he would not be just, right? He would not be holy at that point. So really, you got to kind of put it back into a courtroom setting. It's a legal issue. You can't write sin off, right? So that's why Paul has to explain this. He deals with the sin problem by who? Christ, right? As a propitiation. That's the payment for sin. He pays the debt, right? He paid the debt. So that's how he can be just and the justifier. I think verse 26 really is probably the key verse through the first 3 chapters at least. That God can be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus. Now, verse 27, where is boasting? Can we boast in anything? Right? It's excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith. The law of faith. The law, what's the law mean? It says the law of faith. You got like the law of gravity, right? It's kind of like that. It's a principle, right? The law of faith. It's by faith now, right? This law of faith keeps it from being where somebody can glory in amongst themselves, because can we bring anything? Is there any kind of partnership with God? Most people think there is, don't they? There's some kind of partnership that we have to have. There's something we have to stop doing or something we have to start doing, right? In order to have that favor. I know everybody hears this. You got to give your life to Jesus. Have you heard that? Give your life to Jesus. Do you actually give your life to Jesus? People, that's what they think they're doing, right? What's that mean exactly, though? If you think about it.
Do they think that it's surrendering themselves?
Yeah, it's like a surrender, but then what happens when Mr. Flesh comes up in about the next 45 minutes? Do you re-surrender? You know what I'm saying? So this is why. So when he says the law of faith, faith is the only way, it's the only answer, nothing we could bring, right? It isn't a partnership. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. I know everybody knows this verse, but Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. So in response to faith, well, with faith, what is the only thing that is compatible with faith? It's grace. Okay? Ephesians 2 verse 8. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. That's pretty self-explanatory, ain't it? Not of yourself. There's nothing you can do, nothing you can bring. It is a gift. What is a gift? Because most people functioning in Christianity today, they apparently doesn't understand the definition of a gift, right? You know, Christmas or birthday, I go and get somebody a present and I give it to them. Do I say, well, I expect you to give me what this gift costs because I'm giving you this gift? I mean, we don't do that, do we? You know? So why I don't understand why people can't understand that. God isn't working that way as well. That's what His grace is. It's a gift, right? He gives it freely. Christ took all of it on Himself for all of us. So verse 9, not of works, lest any man should boast. If works was involved, then what would happen? We could boast, right? We would be able to say, hey, Miss Barbara, look what I did. You know, I did this and now God likes me more and I'm saved. He saved me. Right? It's all excluded. None of it, because nothing achieves favor. Only one that achieves favor is Christ, right? He's the one. So, let's go back to Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. And I know, we all understand this, but at the same time, I think it's important for us to renew our mind in it as well. Especially, to me, it helps me appreciate what I came out of. I don't know if everybody else kind of feels that way, but just thinking about years ago and learning and thinking there was these things that needed to be done when Christ did the thing that needed to be done, right? So Romans 5, look at verse 6. These are some of my favorite verses. Romans 5, 6. For when we were yet, what were we? Without strength. Romans 5, 6. That's Romans 5, 8. We'll be there in just a minute. You're good. Romans 5, 6. For when we were yet without strength. What's that mean to be without strength? We were weak, right? We couldn't do anything. Could we? When we were without strength, in due time, Christ died for the people that promised they would change forever and never sin. He died for the ungodly, right? Romans 5, 8. But God commendeth His love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners. There we go, Brandy. Christ died for us, right? Look at this, verse 10. For if when we were what? Enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son. You see that? When we were enemies, when we were sinners, when we were without strength. Because it can only be Christ, right? What amazing grace that is. Because we were all those terrible things. He came and He died for His very enemy. Which is what we were, right? Ephesians chapter 2. We were children of disobedience, walked according to the course of this world, and He came and He gave His life for us, good for nothing puke bags. Talking to myself, mostly. Just think about that. So, the law of faith, it goes with grace. It's the only principle that can be compatible with grace. You can't have law and grace, can you? Can you have the law and grace? No. They cannot operate together. Because it's either by grace or it's by what? works. If it's works, then it's no more grace. It can't work together, can it? It's impossible. So Christ did everything because we could do nothing. He had to do everything. That's amazing. Now, let's go to, we're in Romans, look at chapter 4, verse 16. Chapter 4, verse 16. Right, it says, therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace. Do you see that? It has to be of faith that it might be by grace. So if you look up at verse 13, there it says, for the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. Because the law worketh what? Wrath. For where no law is, there is no transgression. Therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace. You can't blend it. But most people want to blend it. And that's a big issue, isn't it? Amongst believers, amongst, different denominations and all of that. They want to blend the law and grace together and the law and faith, and it can't work that way. So it's of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. It can only be that way so that it might be sure. You see that? That's the only way. All right, now let's go to Titus chapter 3, and then we'll get into the controversy. Titus chapter 3, look at verse 7. So we read those words, we read those verses where it talks about being justified by faith, right? Justified by faith, justified by faith. And now look at here in Titus chapter 3, verse 7, that being justified by what? What's it say there? His grace. You see? Faith and grace. Justified by His grace. That we should be made heirs according to the hope of eternal life. I just wanted to point that out. Justified by His grace. All right, now let's go back to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3, and let's look at verse 28 again. Romans chapter 3, verse 28. It says, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. You see that? So back to the courtroom, as the conclusion is drawn by this, that there's no boasting, it's excluded, there's no works, nothing can be involved, you can bring nothing. Christ did everything, right? And therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Seeing it is one God which shall justify the circumcision by faith and uncircumcision through faith. So now we get into verse 30. Has anybody ever wondered what this verse means? Is there a difference? I guess this should be the first question.
Is there a difference?
Between the by and the through.
Oh, 30.
People have a big problem with this verse. So I wanted to make sure that I talked about it tonight, just to... Somebody's coming in. So I wanted to make sure I had a good, we talked about it really good.
Hey, Quentin.
Hey!
Is John around? I think it's not perfect.
You're good. So by faith and through faith. I don't know. I've just wondered if anybody had ever thought about that or even caught that in verse 30. That one says by and one says through. Has anybody ever wondered what that is?
Yeah, I've been waiting for you.
Okay. All right. So we're good. Yeah, it makes me happy.
I taught it, but I forget.
All right. So number one, most people say that they're synonymous, and I would say that they are in a way. Yes. The issue, first of all, is what is the central issue?
Faith.
It's all faith. So faith is the central issue. That's not going to differ, okay? But try to give an example, and I'll try to explain it because I kind of went around and all over the place trying to figure out what was the best way to explain it, okay? So for example, by implies a method or mechanism, okay? The word by. The word through implies a process or a system, all right? And hopefully I had it worked out how in my head, so I'm hoping I can get it out. All right, so we use an example. We say we don't have these heaters in the walls and we just have that. Runs off of kerosene, right? Do we heat the church by kerosene or through kerosene? How would you say it? By kerosene, right? We heat it by kerosene. All right? Do I get better at the guitar by practice or through practice? I would say through practice. Okay? Now, I don't want to make it real
Okay.
English oriented, but just think, okay? So through practice, it implies a process, right? A process of practicing. By kerosene, we heat, that's the method or mechanism, okay? Now, all right, now, Kurz has a good example, so I'm going to steal his. Can you send something by the mail and through the mail? Both. Yes.
Yeah.
So when you send something by the mail, what is that? The idea there is you put a letter in an envelope, stamp it, it's going by mail, right? But if you send something through the mail, to me, which I think makes a lot of sense, it's the process, the United States Postal Service, through the mail, right? It's implied that it is going to come that way. All right. Hopefully this is going to make sense. Hopefully I'm not losing everybody. So Israel so to me this is key. Notice that he doesn't say Israel and the Gentiles. What does he say? Circumcision and uncircumcision. Why? Because the circumcision was given what? The law, the promises. They had an opportunity, not saying they could, because what was the purpose of the law? To show they couldn't. But God gives them the law, so they had an opportunity, they could be justified, right? We're going to see a verse that they sought it not by faith, but by the law. See kind of where this is going? So for them it's a method, because they were the uncircumcision ever given the law. There was no method for them. That's why for them it's a process or a system. Does that make sense? Or am I losing everybody?
No, I get it.
Hopefully I'm not getting too complicated, but
It's not, I just have to have time to.
so think about this. That Israel had every opportunity to be justified, right?
Yeah.
It's always by faith, always. But they sought it by the law instead of by faith. That's why Paul's going to say the circumcision by faith. Because instead, they went by the law, the method. Okay? Gentiles didn't have anything. So their justification is through faith. Okay? Through faith, because now they have a system by which they can be justified. Does that make sense? it's still by faith, and it's not any different, okay? The only difference, which we'll talk about more later, is at this point in time, that's why I've got this drawn back to Mount Sinai. At this point in time, would their faith be in a crucified Christ, risen, buried, and risen again on the third day for their sins? No. So it's not the faith, it's always God and what? His word, right? What he said. But what he says, or what's going on at the time, is different, right? That would differ based upon dispensation, correct? So, let's go to Galatians chapter 2, and hopefully I can show a couple of verses. Galatians chapter 2, look at verse 16. So the issue is faith. He says, will justify the circumcision by faith and the uncircumcision through faith. So just keep that in mind. The method and the process, okay? So Galatians 2, look at verse 16. It says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So I just wanted to show that by. See that? By the law, by the works of the law. Now go to Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9. Look at verse 30. Romans 9, verse 30. To me, this helps explain it. This is the best part to help explain verse 30 of chapter 30. Is Romans 9:30. All right? It says, what shall we say then? That the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith? And you see what's the issue here? It's righteousness, right? Verse 31, but Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not, how? By faith. You see? But as it were, by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone. Alright, and then who was the stumbling stone? Christ, right? They stumbled at Christ. But see that. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith. That's why Paul uses the word by here. Okay? Because it shows the method they were seeking righteousness by was wrong. By the law, right? By the law. They really worshipped the law. That's really what they did, didn't they? I'm going to still use another example that I thought was really good. For example, God tells me, Andy, I want you to pick up sticks. Okay? And I start picking up sticks. And I just keep picking them up. And finally I get to the point where I'm the best stick picker upper ever. Okay? And I keep picking up sticks. And then I get a group together and I make this school. And I'm going to teach everybody else how to pick up sticks the right way, the wrong way, when to do it, the best time to do it. And then we're going to have a church. And they called it the first church of stick picking up. Picking upping. Yes. That's what he called it. I thought it was great. At that point in time, what am I focused on? Picking up sticks. I lost sight of what? Who told me to pick up the sticks? God did. You see what I'm saying? See, with Israel, he gives them the law. Why? Galatians calls the law what? It was their schoolmaster. It was supposed to teach them what? You can't do it. Christ is the only one. That's who you need. That's who it's supposed to point to. Let's go to John chapter 5 real quick. John chapter 5. Look at verse 39. John chapter 5, verse 39. It says, "Search the scriptures, for in them ye think ye have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me." What's Paul say about the scriptures? What does he say about Christ? They're the what kind of riches? The unsearchable riches, right? With the body of Christ. And then here Christ says, search. I just think that's pretty neat. Now, but look at verse 46. He says, "For had ye believed Moses, ye would have believed me, for he wrote of me." What books did Moses write? The first 5, right? And those are all contain what? Well, besides Genesis, the law, right? It's God, the giving of the law. Moses wrote of Christ. You see that? And then if you look at John chapter 1, John chapter 1, verse 44 says, "Now Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip findeth Nathanael and saith unto him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." You see that? Moses in the law. The law was supposed to what? Point them to the Messiah, point them to Christ, right? Instead, what do? They wanted to pick up sticks, right? So, just keep that in mind. You go back to this by and through. Can you, everybody see that? The by faith is because they were seeking by what? The law. That was their every bit in focus, right? I mean, they go out there and God, does the things after he delivers them from Egypt, and then they say, well, whatever you say, that's what we'll do, right? Instead of seeing what God was trying to teach them was that they needed him to take care of them, right? To provide for them. But they were like, well, we can perform, we can do it. Because if you say, do this and then we're blessed, hey, we can do that. Because it makes us feel good, right? Makes you feel good when you perform. So that's my take on the by and the through. Okay? Method versus the system, the process. All right, now let's go back to Romans 3. I'll look at verse 31, and then we'll close. Romans 3:31. He says, "Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, yea, we establish the law." What does that mean, we establish the law? Anybody? A lot of people think that who fulfilled the law? Christ did, right? How do we establish the law? Through faith. To establish means that you firmly settle. What does the law say? There's none righteous. No, not one. What's the law? Also, the law says you're guilty. Right? That's how it's established. Because the law, can we do anything through the law? It just says we're guilty, right? Christ and his propitiatory work is what does everything for us, right? All right, so I'm going to close.